Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Roxanne smiled apologetically. I'm sorry, but I'm not in the mood for that recently. Although she rejected him pleasantly, the rich gentleman was slightly disappointed. However, he turned around and left without forcing his way through. Finally, she had once again gotten the peace and quiet she longed for. Just as she was about to gather her emotions, she suddenly heard a familiar voice calling out to her. Roxanne? Is that you? Hearing that, Roxanne raised her gaze in the direction of the voice. She then saw a charming man in a gray tuxedo staring at her in bewilderment. As soon as their eyes met, Roxanne's eyes lit up. In a surprised tone, she uttered, Larry? What a coincidence. Larry Morrison was a senior she met abroad. Internationally speaking, he was one of the elites of the younger generation. Back then, Larry had helped Roxanne a lot when she had just gone abroad. Therefore, they shared a pretty good relationship. When she returned to the country, she was too busy with matters concerning the research institute, so she never had a chance to reach out to him. Upon seeing that he had not mistaken someone else for her, Larry put on a bright smile and went up to Roxanne. It's been a long time. Roxanne smiled and nodded. Indeed. When did you come back to the country? Why didn't you contact me? Larry sized her up and said, I've been back for a fortnight now. I did think of reaching out to you, but I was afraid that I might disturb you. After not seeing you for so long, you seem to have lost weight. Have you been busy with work in Chania? Roxanne simply smiled and answered, You can say so. Although she was busy with the research institute, her workload was nothing compared to when she was abroad. I'm sure I've lost weight because of those 3 little ones at home. Sal, I shouldn't reveal my personal matters to Larry. Larry looked at her worriedly and said, I know you're a workaholic, but you ought to look after yourself. Don't tire yourself out. Roxanne merely nodded in response. By the way, why are you here? Are you already working with Queen Group despite only returning to the country recently? Larry asked with a smile. Roxanne was stunned for a moment upon hearing that. When she remembered who those guests at the banquet were, she smiled and shook her head. I've only returned to the country recently, so how could I have done that? I was invited because I just happened to have cured old Mr. Queen's illness. However, I guess it's also right to say that I'm working with the Queen family. They're our research institute's medicine supplier. Larry was astonished. I've heard about how bad old Mr. Queen's condition was, and a lot of renowned doctors had failed to cure him. When I heard he was cured, I wondered who the amazing doctor was. Who would have thought it was you? Roxanne pressed her lips into a smile. I was just lucky. It just happens to fall into my area of specialty. Larry arched a brow and said, Stop being so humble, will you? I don't know about the others, but I know your capabilities like the back of my hand. However, knowing that you're the one who cured old Mr. Queen, I'm still very impressed. You flatter me too much, Larry. Roxanne laughed. The two of them chatted happily about Alfred's illness and each other's medical fields. Nearby, Lucian saw a man approach Roxanne and left just moments earlier. His gaze darkened when he saw her talking happily with another man. He was so displeased that everyone nearby could feel the icy aura he was exuding. Naturally, Jonathan noticed what was going on, and he could tell why Lucian was displeased. Lucian, would you like to go over there and see what's going on? He asked. After seeing them interacting with each other a few times, Jonathan seemed to have figured something out. At the very least, he had noticed that Lucian's attitude toward Roxanne was far from what he expected. When he found out about their relationship prior to that, Jonathan thought Lucian would ignore Roxanne. However, it was the complete opposite. In fact, he could tell that Lucian was helping her out in every way he could. Aubrey, on the other hand, was utterly disregarded. Upon seeing their interactions, Jonathan could tell that Lucian cared about Roxanne more. Hence, that was why he had suggested so after seeing the scene before his eyes and Lucian's sudden displeasure. Lucian frowned and ignored Jonathan's question while wearing a grim expression. Jonathan knew Lucian very well, so he pretended to sound troubled when he voiced, "Since I've invited Dr. Jarvis personally, I don't think it's nice of me to leave her unattended. I'm going to have a chat with her. Would you like to come along?" Lucian only responded in agreement after a few seconds. The two of them excused themselves from the crowd and left. Meanwhile, Roxanne was still having a nice conversation with Larry. Suddenly she saw those two approaching from behind Larry. Her smile faded a little and she frowned. "Mr. Morrison, when did you return to the country? Why didn't you let me know you're back?" Jonathan patted Larry's shoulder casually. Larry turned around to flash a smile. After exchanging some pleasantries with Larry, Jonathan took a quick glance at Lucian before asking Larry nonchalantly, "Do you know Dr. Jarvis?" Larry nodded and smiled. "Yes. I know her well, actually." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat when he heard that. When he instinctively glanced at Lucian, he saw Lucian's expression had turned cold. As a matter of fact, the atmosphere turned cold instantly. Jonathan went silent as well. All of a sudden, an awkward moment ensued. "Jonathan, who's this gentleman?" Lucian's indifferent voice broke the silence. Jonathan shuddered before pushing Larry toward Lucian while retreating to the side himself. "Oh, I've forgotten to introduce you guys to each other. This is Larry Morrison from the Morrison family. Mr. Morrison is a medical practitioner and he's abroad most of the time." With that, he introduced Lucian to Larry. "This is Lucian Farwell. Mr. Farwell is the CEO of Farwell Group. You've heard of him, right?" As soon as those words fell, Lucian reached out his hand expressionlessly. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Morrison. Nice to meet you." Although it was a very gentleman-like gesture, Larry felt as though Lucian had considered him an enemy. After a moment of hesitation, Larry reached to shake Lucian's hand. "I've heard about you ages ago, Mr. Farwell. Roxanne and you are." As he was speaking, Larry subconsciously glanced at Roxanne. When he was about to complete his sentence, Roxanne interrupted, "Larry, I don't know Mr. Farwell that well. You don't have to talk about me to him." Roxanne looked at Lucian with a distant look in her eyes as she nodded at him indifferently as a sign of greeting. Upon seeing that, Larry stopped talking immediately. After glancing at Roxanne and Lucian, he changed the topic and said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Yet you're a famous young man, Mr. Farwell. I'm honored to meet you." Lucian took notice of the interaction between those two. When Lucian noticed the chemistry between them, he frowned in displeasure. He had also only responded to Larry with an expressionless nod. Although he didn't finish his sentence just now, I know what he was going to say. Although I've never met him, he knows about my relationship with Roxanne. He was about to talk about what happened 6 years ago. Why would Roxanne tell him about that? What exactly is their relationship like? With those thoughts running through his mind, Lucian's infuriation was for everyone to see. In an instant, the atmosphere between the four silenced as the eyes of the entire crowd fell on her. Roxanne frowned with discomfort. She did not want to interact with Lucian more than was necessary. Instead, she turned to Jonathan. "What brings you here, Mr. Queen?" Jonathan chuckled after a startled pause. "It doesn't seem very polite to have invited you and then not pay attention to you, so I thought I'd come and have a chat." In the ensuing silence of his proclamation, he shot Lucian a meaningful look. The latter appeared indifferent. It was evident that he had no intention of clarifying the matter. Jonathan had no choice but to take the blame. Roxanne smiled faintly. "I don't mind. In fact, I happen to have run into Larry here. As we rarely see each other, we have our own catching up to do. Though I appreciate your kindness, there's no need for you to entertain me." Jonathan choked at her subtle dismissal. He was trying to find another excuse to stay for a chat when the sound of a pair of approaching heels drew his attention to it. "There you are, Lucian." Aubrey's voice rang out. "Your mother has been looking for you. You should go see what she wants." Jonathan had no choice but to hold back the excuse he had conceived. Lucian frowned but did not leave immediately. The woman behind him had already arrived by his side, staring daggers at Roxanne as she approached. Roxanne felt nauseated at the sight of the couple standing together. "It appears that you have something to do. Don't let me bother you." With that, she whispered something to Larry and the pair of them turned to leave. Standing beside Lucian, Aubrey constantly reminded him that Sonia wanted him, preventing him from dissuading Roxanne from leaving. "Mrs. Farwell seems to be in a hurry. I'd better come with you." Aubrey felt her heart turning cold upon noticing his gaze lingering on the woman in the distance. In a panic, her reminders increased both in urgency and in pitch. Already irritable, Lucian turned to give her such a cold glare that Aubrey's voice sputtered to a halt. The next second, the man stalked past her indifferently without even deigning to give her another glance. Aubrey was stunned for a few seconds before she regained her composure and marched quickly in his wake with gritted teeth. Meanwhile, Roxanne and Larry found a quiet corner to sit at. Larry could not stop himself from asking, "What's going on between you and Mr. Farwell, Roxanne?" Roxanne smiled. "There's nothing going on. We met by chance." However, Larry's gaze appeared doubtful. "Really? I thought you two were planning to get back together." The hostility emanating from Lucian earlier was fresh in his mind. Roxanne did not expect him to have such a misleading sense of intuition. "How could that be?" she exclaimed sarcastically. "Weren't you paying attention?" His fiancée was next to him. Larry was about to ask another question, but Roxanne made her refusal to discuss the subject plain by changing it bluntly. "Let's talk about something else. Where were we?" She was referring to their topic of conversation before Jonathan's arrival. Obliging her wishes, Larry did not ask any further. He resumed their conversation about medicine from where they left off. As both were leaders in the field, they soon left private matters behind and were engaged in an exciting discourse. Roxanne was initially resigned to a dreary evening spent at the birthday banquet, but Larry's appearance made her attendance worthwhile after all. However, she was beginning to grow anxious when the banquet did not show any signs of ending despite it being already 10 at night. The 3 children at home, especially Essie, were waiting up for her. The little girl had only been able to fall asleep for the past few nights under coaxing. She might have difficulty falling asleep if Roxanne was not there with her. All that alarming thought, Roxanne hurriedly ended the conversation with Larry before rising to say goodbye to Alfred. Jonathan's parents and Sonia were with Alfred. After Lucian learned that he had been summoned for no apparent reason, he was just about to leave when Roxanne and Larry appeared in single file. "If there's nothing else, Mr. Queen, I'd like to return as the children are waiting for me." Roxanne politely bid him farewell. Henrietta was a little surprised. "Leaving so soon? It's only halfway through the dinner party. Stay a little longer." Roxanne smiled apologetically. "Maybe another time. I'm worried about the children at home." Everyone present knew that she had 2 children. Thus they decided to oblige her insistence. Alfred beckoned Jonathan over. "I'm worried about Dr. Jarvis returning home alone this time of night. Give her a ride." The next moment, Jonathan turned to examine Lucian's expression. Taking his lack of displeasure as a sign of consent, Jonathan was about to obey his grandfather when Larry's voice rang out. "Don't bother yourself. I have to get home early to attend an online seminar that's starting soon. I can drop Roxanne off on my way home." Jonathan felt a tangible drop in the air pressure around him when Larry spoke. Clearing his throat, he was about to reclaim his errand when another cold voice cut across him. I don't mind sending Ms. Jarvis home on your behalf, Mr. Morrison, seeing as you are so busy with work. As if addressing the crowd was not enough, Lucian then slowed down his speech to ensure that every word of his was caught. Just as well, too. I can drop by Ms. Jarvis to see my daughter. Everybody present was stunned in an instant, with Sonia and Aubrey appearing crestfallen. They had made arrangements for Lucian to attend the banquet with Aubrey in an endeavor to spend romantic time together. Moreover, their public appearance would imply that their wedding was imminent to the guests present. Lucian's declaration of sending Roxanne home and the mention of his daughter felt like a slap to their faces. Aubrey turned pale. Clenching her fists to restrain herself, she was dangerously close to losing her temper. Your daughter? Larry was puzzled. What does Lucian's daughter have to do with Roxanne? Lucian was indifferent to the reaction he had caused. My daughter has been staying at Ms. Jarvis for the past 2 days. Is there a problem with me stopping by to see her? He did not lower his voice, and his words reached the ears of the surrounding guests. A chorus of discussion and gossip erupted after a short silence. Aubrey did not expect Lucian to be that blatant. Her face turned ashen as she listened to the discussion around her. Clenching her jaw, she lowered her head to avoid the guests' curious eyes. The elders of the Queen family were also very surprised. They were aware of what Estella meant to Lucian. Therefore, they were surprised to learn how Lucian and Roxanne were close to the extent of having Estella entrusted in her care. It sounds as if Estella has been living with Roxanne for a while. That was news to Jonathan, too. As shocked as he was, he felt he should have seen it coming. Upon second thought, he decided to remain silent. In an instant, the atmosphere among the crowd became very strange. Equally shocked, Roxanne bit her lip in secret anxiety as she tried to calm herself down. While the crowd was more surprised that Estella was living with her, Roxanne was more concerned about the fact that Lucian had announced it so outrightly. What's going on here? Racking her brains for something to say, she intended to defuse the palpable tension in the air. Before she could, somebody grabbed her wrist. Weren't you in a hurry? Let's get going. Lucian's cold voice sounded in her ears before the grip on her wrist tightened. Roxanne regained her senses abruptly and was forced to abandon her notion. She only had time to utter a hasty goodbye to Alfred before being dragged away by Lucian. Grabbed by the wrist, Roxanne was almost forcibly pulled out of the banquet in plain sight of the crowd. She tried to break free several times, but the man's grip was tight enough to dissuade such an attempt. It was not until they arrived outside that the grip on her wrist slackened. Roxanne pulled away with a grimace and took several steps back to distance herself from him. Thank you for your kindness, but I can drive home on my own. There's no need to bother you, Mr. Farwell, to see me personally home. Your mother and fiancé are still inside. You should get back in there and accompany them. At that, she started toward the manor's gate while avoiding him. Initially planning to slip out and return on her own, Roxanne did not expect the situation to escalate to such a degree. She still could not believe that Lucian was capable of such a feat. Roxanne's mind was a mess. All she wanted was some quiet to herself. As soon as she strode past Lucian, he caught her wrist again in a grip even tighter than before. Roxanne stopped in her tracks. Suppressing the turmoil in her heart, she looked at the figure beside her with as much calm as she could muster. Is there anything else, Mr. Farwell? Frowning, Lucian found only apathy in her eyes. A trace of displeasure crossed his heart at the thought of her smile when she was conversing with Larry. As I said, I want to see my daughter. Dropping you off happens to be en route for me. I want my daughter to sleep early, so please stop wasting time and get in the car. I drove here, Roxanne insisted. And Catalina is watching them at home. You can go ahead, Mr. Farwell. His stern face darkened further at her repeated rejections while his eyes filled with anger at her defiance. You had a couple of drinks earlier tonight, if I recall correctly. Are you planning to be charged with driving under the influence? Roxanne frowned instead of answering immediately. Before she could respond, Lucian grabbed her wrist and took her to the side of the car. Roxanne could not break free nor refute his reason. He wants to see his daughter, so he's not going out of his way to send me home. I would look like a churlish, self-indulgent idiot if I refused him again. Besides, he is right. I did have 2 drinks at the banquet. Caden was already holding the car door for them when the couple arrived, though Roxanne was still somewhat reluctant. Weren't you in a hurry to go home? Lucian demanded. Or was that an excuse for not wanting to stay at the banquet? Roxanne had no choice but to get in without further delay. Lucian followed closely behind and sat beside her. She silently moved to the window to distance herself from him, wearing an uncomfortable glower as she did so. The journey back was spent in complete silence as neither of them spoke a word. Caden tried his best to diminish his presence by making his movements as noiseless as possible. The car was dead silent. Lucian's eyes darkened at the sight of the woman's profile through the reflection on the car window. She was wearing a smile when she spoke to the man at the dinner party earlier. In my presence, she's wearing such an expression instead. The more he pondered the matter, the more it stung. Unable to bear the silence any longer, he cleared his throat. Who is that Mr. Morrison to you? He mentioned that you know each other well. Roxanne froze for a moment at the sudden question before glancing at him coldly. I don't think it's any of your business. She withdrew her gaze indifferently before turning to look out the window, with obvious intent not to speak again. The car lapsed once more into silence. The chill emanating from Lucian was almost tangible. Caden wished he was anywhere else but in that car. He even breathed carefully for fear of attracting the attention of his 2 passengers. At long last, the car arrived at the gate of Roxanne's house. Almost eagerly, Caden stepped on the brakes before stumbling out of the car to open the door for the couple seated at the back. Only upon seeing their figures enter the villa did he finally breathe a long sigh of relief. For some reason, the atmosphere is never pleasant whenever Mr. Farwell spends time with Ms. Jarvis. Mommy! You're back! As soon as Roxanne walked through the door, the 3 children greeted her with lovely smiles. It was the first time they saw Roxanne's outfit. You look so pretty tonight, Mommy, Benny said sweetly. Roxanne's mood improved when she saw the 3 children, and she beamed at his compliment. Thank you, my dear. Archie was about to add something when he saw another figure entering through the door. Though the corners of his mouth turned downward after he recognized the figure, he still politely greeted his guest, albeit somewhat distantly. Hello, Mr. Farwell. The sound of his brother's voice drew Benny's attention to the person behind his mother. A look of anticipation flashed in his eyes as he greeted the man obediently. Lucian nodded curtly to the 2 boys. Despite his claims of coming for Estella, Lucian's gaze merely swept over the girl before landing on Roxanne again. Archie and Benny smelled the alcohol by that point and looked at their mother with concern. Have you been drinking, Mommy? Does your head hurt? Roxanne smiled warmly. Not at all. I've only had a little. Despite her assurance, the 2 boys remained uneasy. Archie ran to the medical kit for the hangover pills while Benny thoughtfully poured a glass of water and placed it on the coffee table. Estella quickly joined in and helped Roxanne to the couch. With the meticulous care provided by the 3 children, Roxanne forgot all about the negativity she had encountered earlier that evening. As he watched his mother gulp down the hangover pills, Archie hesitated for a moment before turning to the man who was still standing at the door. Did you drink as well? Lucian raised his brow slightly. A little. Archie looked at the tablets in his hand and then at the man at the door. He walked over hesitantly. Would you like one? Lucian's deep gaze warmed slightly as he leaned over to accept the boy's offer. Thank you. Archie merely pursed his lips without responding. He then returned to Roxanne's side after putting the hangover pills back. Roxanne was busy fretting over the children, caressing the heads of each one in turn. "What have you three been up to tonight?" Excited to answer the question, Benny grabbed Roxanne's arm to help her up. The latter rose to her feet curiously and followed him to the carpet. In its center stood a fairy tale castle nearly 1 meter tall, made of Lego. Benny ran over proudly. "We finished building the castle." Archie and Estella shared in his excitement. Roxanne examined it for several minutes, her eyes full of surprise. When Estella arrived under her care, it occurred to Roxanne that the little girl may not enjoy her son's toys. That was why she decided to get them something they could work on together. The Lego set was only purchased a week ago. Despite the project containing a total of over 20,000 pieces of Lego bricks, the children finished it remarkably quickly. "You kids are amazing," Roxanne exclaimed, grinning. The children glowed at her praise. Estella ran to the side of the model as fast as her short legs could carry her and pointed to a small room on the left side of the castle with a stubby finger. She then turned to look at Roxanne with bright eyes that were full of anticipation. Roxanne was a little confused by the little girl's actions. The boys had been interacting with Estella long enough that they knew what she meant by observing her expressions and gestures. On the other hand, it remained an elusive task for Roxanne. Estella was becoming anxious at Roxanne's prolonged confusion. Once more, she pointed to the room and then to herself while pouting. Roxanne was more bewildered than ever. "Essie means to tell you that she assembled that part, Mommy," Archie explained. Comprehension dawned on Roxanne's face at last. Smiling so broadly that her eyes were crinkled, she gushed, "That's a lot of bricks, Estella." "Great job." Estella's eyes sparkled at the compliment from the beautiful woman she held in such high regard. As she turned to look at her father, her little face shone with similar excitement. The four of them got along well together. Lucian knew what it meant when he suddenly met the expectant look of his daughter, though he could not think of any words of praise of his own except to give her an approving nod. "Well done, Essie." Estella smiled so broadly that her dimples deepened. Lucian's eyes darkened a little at his daughter's delight. He could feel a confused torrent of emotions welling up within him. It is obvious that Essie is happier with Roxanne. "I've never seen her smile this much." Despite spending all night completing a Lego palace, Benny was not satisfied. He grabbed his mother's hand coyly. "This castle was too simple, Mommy. Could you get us something more difficult?" Roxanne glanced at Estella hesitantly. She was just about to suggest that the two boys accommodate Estella when Benny added, "Essie is also very good at Lego. She's going to catch up to Archie and me." Roxanne stared at Archie in disbelief, who nodded vigorously in allocation. Meanwhile, Estella patted her chest confidently, her face full of anticipation. Roxanne did not need any more convincing. "All right. I'll get you a new set tomorrow." Exhilaration shone on the faces of the three children. Archie and Benny delved at once into detailed and long-winded specifics of the model they wanted. Standing by the door, Lucian watched the four of them enjoying themselves. He remained silent for a long time. It was close to midnight when he spoke again. After suggesting that the children be tucked in, Lucian bid them farewell. Roxanne was only too glad about his departure. She only put up with his presence for Estella's sake. After the door shut behind him, she took Estella to the door to watch him leave. Lucian seethed throughout his journey home. Upon arriving, he furrowed his brows at the sight of a figure seated on his couch. "So you still remembered to come home, huh?" Sonia reprimanded in displeasure. Intending to take the opportunity to have Lucian come to terms with his marriage with Aubrey, Sonia was scandalized to witness her son offer Roxanne a ride home in plain sight. Their intimacy also irritated her. Though Sonia could not conceal her displeasure after her son's abrupt departure, she managed to hold on until the banquet ended before rushing over immediately. Initially, she thought that Lucian would have been back at so late an hour. She did not expect to wait for over another hour before seeing him. What did the two of them do at Roxanne's house for over an hour? Sonia's face contorted with rage at that thought. Lucian felt a similar dislike for his mother's behavior that night. "What can I do for you this late at night, Mom?" he asked coldly. Sonia's scowl deepened. "Can't your mother drop by in her free time? Are you aware of how embarrassed Aubrey was after you left? Outrageous behavior. Aubrey again." Lucian's coldness bordered on hostility by that point. "I've told you before. Stay out of my business. I can handle them myself. If there is nothing else, you can see yourself out." Without another word, he went upstairs. Meanwhile, Aubrey had returned to the Pearson residence with her parents. The three retained a grim expression all along their way back. Upon stepping foot into the house, Aubrey kicked off the heels on her feet. Gina had wanted to comfort her, but before she could, the latter already strode upstairs with a sullen look on her face. What followed next was an ear-shattering door slam. "Looks like she's really mad." Upstairs, Aubrey clenched her fists tightly after slamming the door shut. She was trembling in rage as the voices of the crowd at the dinner party rang in her ears. You'd think that her marriage with Mr. Farwell is finally happening given how arrogant she is, but who knew? Didn't the Pearson family rely on the Farwell family to get to where they are today? Just look at Mr. Farwell. I'm sure the Pearsons will have a hard time in the future. Alas, it was all for nothing after waiting for that long. Huh. What a joke. Ever since Lucian took Roxanne with him and left in front of everybody, those guests started treating Aubrey in a different way, from politeness at the beginning to mockery and disdain. They could not be bothered with her feelings and would even gossip about her while she was present at the scene. Within a few minutes, she had turned from the future Mrs. Farwell, whom everybody was envious of in Harrington, to the crowd's laughing stock. Displeasure built up within her at the thought of her initial motive of attending the dinner party. She had wanted to make Roxanne acknowledge her own status. Little did she expect that Lucian would actually embarrass her in front of so many people. I'm sure after tonight, Harrington's high society will definitely spread rumors about how the engagement between Lucian and me has fallen through. My efforts have all become futile because of that woman. With that thought in mind, her expression turned downright vicious, and she swept across the table in rage, sending everything lying to the ground. It's all that Batch's fault. If not for her, things wouldn't have come to where it is today. I won't let her off that easily. Downstairs, Gina and Samuel could clearly hear the commotion coming from Aubrey's room. It's too much. Gina could not help but grumble. What did Lucian mean by that? He left Aubrey behind while so many people were watching. How are the others going to think of us? Samuel's face turned red with rage. He obviously doesn't give a den about us. While the couple was fuming and the racket in the room continued, Roxanne was clueless about the incident between the two families. As she had consumed some alcohol at the dinner party, coupled with her interaction with Lucian along the way back, she was feeling worn out and thus headed to bed early after playing with the kids for a short while. In the early morning, Estella's motions jolted Roxanne awake. She groggily got up to carry her and lay for a while longer before she felt much more awake. By the time she headed downstairs after helping Estella wash up, Catalina had already finished preparing breakfast. Archie and Benny were already seated downstairs as well. At the sight of Roxanne coming down while holding hands with Estella, the two kids stared at her as they asked earnestly, "Mommy, do you have a headache?" Along with Estella, Roxanne sat beside the two boys and shook her head, smiling. "Thanks to you boys for bringing me the pills last night, my head doesn't hurt at all." Archie and Benny heaved a sigh of relief when they heard those words. Following that, Roxanne had breakfast with the three children. Right then, the doorbell rang. Roxanne got up to open the door, and a frown crept up her face at the door. "It's so early. Is anything the matter, eh?" A tall and slender Lucian stood in front of the door and tilted his body slightly to reveal a line of bodyguards behind him. Every one of them was carrying a large box. Seeing those bodyguards grasping onto the boxes lightly without any expression, Roxanne was overwhelmed with puzzlement. "This is," Lucian responded. "Lego. I heard the kids saying they wanted to play with it yesterday, so I got my assistant to buy some for them in the middle of the night. There are also some challenging puzzles inside. I think they will like it." Roxanne was promptly at a loss. She then shifted her gaze back to those cold-looking, muscular bodyguards. Somehow she thought the vibe they gave off did not match what they were holding in their hands. "Let them send the boxes in first." Lucian gestured for the bodyguards to head inside the house. Roxanne hesitated for a few seconds before she moved aside for those men to put the boxes down. Concurrently, when the 3 children in the dining area heard the noises, they immediately ran out. Archie and Benny's eyes lit up as they stood next to the boxes, staring at them intently. On the other hand, Estella twirled around Lucian once before she went up to her brothers and followed what they were doing. Wonderstruck by what was before him, Benny pestered Roxanne to open the boxes for them. He had never expected that there would be Lego right in the house that morning when he had only asked for it the night before. Moreover, there were also limited edition puzzles that he had wanted but dared not ask Roxanne to buy as they were too expensive. And to his surprise, they were inside those boxes too. Even Archie could no longer contain his excitement. "Are these for us?" Benny looked at the man at the door, his eyes gleaming with joy. Lucian nodded quietly in response. As soon as Benny received the man's alteration, he cheered in a sweet voice and smiled brightly. "Thank you, Mr. Farwell." Archie, in contrast, was slightly more reserved. He curled the corners of his lips upward as he thanked the man. "I'm happy to know that you guys love it," Lucian said with a nod. Their interaction caused Roxanne's forehead to crease as worry began to surge inside her. Lucian thought she did not like him giving presents to the kids without informing her beforehand, so he casually mentioned, "Estella loves these toys too. The 3 of you can play together." In other words, he was implying that those gifts were for his daughter, and Archie and Benny were merely basking in her glory. Hearing him say that, Roxanne had no choice but to acquiesce to leaving those toys behind. Having completed his mission, Lucian did not stay for longer and hurried to the office. Roxanne briefly put away the boxes and headed for the research institute after leaving the kids in Pippa's care at the school. As soon as she entered the office, her phone rang. When Roxanne saw the caller ID on the screen, her eyes lit up, and she immediately answered the call with a smile. On the other end of the call, Harvey's casual voice sounded. "Are you busy?" Roxanne shook her head. "No, I just arrived at work." "Is anything the matter?" "It's been a long time since you called me." Since her return to the country, the two had barely contacted each other. Most of the time, Roxanne would be the one calling him to report to him on the progress at the research institute. And because Harvey was usually busy with research, his replies were normally curt. This was the first time Harvey actually called her. "Indeed, there's something I need your help with." Harvey went straight to the point. "There's a project that I need you to follow up with its research and development. I'll forward you the details in a while. Take a look at it." Having learned that it was about work matters, Roxanne agreed readily. The two had a brief chat about that project before she concernedly tried to find out about Harvey's return. "When are you coming back?" "Let me pick you up." Harvey looked at his schedule and replied, "Probably not that soon. I'll let you know before I return." Roxanne acknowledged with a curt reply. Since Alfred's treatment had come to an end, all that was required next was to prescribe him medication regularly and remind him to take the pills on time. As such, there was no need for Roxanne to go over to the Queen residence now and then. And now that she had plenty of time, she spent almost the whole day at the Research Institute, either handling miscellaneous work or heading to the research facility and joining the other researchers in the research. As Colby had been working as her assistant while she was overseas previously, he continued helping her. Needless to say, the two had a great rapport. That particular day, the two walked out of the research facility earlier than usual as they had finally achieved a breakthrough in their research. Colby suggested, "Since we've been so busy for the past few days, why don't we have a meal together to celebrate?" Roxanne glanced at the time and apologized, "Let's do it another day. I still have to pick my kids up." It did not seem proper for Colby to insist since Roxanne had given that reason. And so the two left the research institute and went in separate ways. Upon getting into the car, Roxanne's phone rang again. This time it was a call from Larry. "What is it, Larry?" Larry's gentle voice rang out from the other end of the line. "Do you have time later? We haven't had time to meet up after coming back here. I wonder if I have the honor of having you join me for a meal, Dr. Jarvis?" Just as Roxanne wanted to use the same excuse she had given Colby earlier, Larry interrupted, "I've booked a restaurant and am only waiting for you to come over." Hearing that, she swallowed her words back. It was true that she was in a rush to pick up the 3 children, but since Larry was so adamant about having a meal with her, she reckoned it would be inappropriate if she refused any further. Besides, Larry had offered her a lot of help when she was abroad. No matter what, it did not seem right for her to leave the man all by himself. "All right. Where are you? I'll head over now." Eventually, she accepted his invitation. At once, Larry gave her the restaurant's name and location, almost as though he knew her answer beforehand. Roxanne promptly agreed. After concluding the call, she made another call to Catalina, asking the latter to help pick the children up from the kindergarten. With that, she changed her route and headed toward the address Larry provided her. By the use she arrived, Larry had already waited for her for quite some time. At the sight of Roxanne, he waved and beckoned her over. Hurrying over and settling down in the seat opposite his, she said apologetically, "Sorry for the wait." Larry smiled. "No worries. Did I disturb you while you were at work earlier?" Back when they were overseas, Roxanne would often forget about the time because of work. At times, she would even stay up the entire night for work. Roxanne giggled while shaking her head. "No, I just happened to have ended work earlier today." Having said that, she beckoned the waiter and turned to Larry. "Let me treat you to a meal today since I'm late. Besides, I returned earlier than you, so we'll treat this as a welcoming feast for you." Larry readily agreed, "Well then, don't mind if I do." After ordering some food, the two began chatting about work and gradually became engrossed in the conversation. At that moment, the restaurant manager marched in, leading a group of people behind him. Surrounded by men, Lucian had to tilt his head every so often to listen to them talk. As he happened to turn in a direction, he spotted a familiar silhouette sitting at a table by the window. His face instantly darkened when he took a second look at the two figures chatting happily. "Mr. Farwell?" Baffled, someone in the group called out to him, noticing that he suddenly stopped in his tracks. Lucian's brows scrunched up as he slowly withdrew his gaze and followed the crowd into a private room. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.